Now, one of the events or series of events in the history of humanity, and certainly of the 20th century, that remains fixed in our minds. In fact, I think it is the subject of countless movies, books, poems, whatever, on a continuing basis, is something called the Holocaust. The word Holocaust was first used to describe a sacrifice in the Bible where you burned everything. And the Holocaust referred to the extermination of almost 1/2 of European Jewry between 1939 and 1945. It was one of the most horrible crimes ever committed in the history of humanity. It defines the meaning at its extreme form of the word genocide. And in the process, 6 million Jews were exterminated. Now, at the heart of the Holocaust was an ideology. And that ideology is called anti-Semitism. And the word anti-Semitism is comparatively new. It was not used until 1879 when a Prussian or German writer by the name of Wilhelm Marr invented the term, and with great deliberation. Anti-Semitism is more than hostility to Jews or ethnic hostility. I mean, there's all kinds of ethnic hostility around where one nation hates another nation. I mean, nothing new. It's more than simply violence between groups. It's more than the hatred of religion, because anti-Semitism is not anti-Judaism. Anti-Judaism is the hatred of the Jewish religion. And the cure for it, if you don't like it, and you don't want, you don't want to endure it, and you're Jewish, is you convert. And therefore that should be the cure, right? If you cease to be Jewish by religion and you now become Christian by religion, then that should cure it, right? But in the case of the anti-Semite, it makes absolutely no difference. The anti-Semite is not interested in the Jewish religion. He is interested in the Jew. So you can become a devout Catholic, you can become a raving Buddhist, you can become an outstanding atheist. It doesn't make any difference. For the anti-Semite, your Jewish identity is a matter of birth and not a matter of choice. So Marr carefully chose the word. He chose a word that referred not to the religion. That would be anti-Judaism, right? He chose a word that referred to the ethnic origins of the Jewish people. He chose the word Semitic. And that was very, very deliberate. So anti-Semitism, above all and first of all, is directed not to the Jewish religion, it is directed to the Jew. Whether religious, not religious, whether converted, not converted, doesn't make any difference. And secondly, what's very important, which makes it different from ordinary ethnic hostility, it includes the demonization of the Jew. Now, demonization is different from hatred. You may hate your neighbor for good reason. You know, the noise is too loud, they dump the garbage. I mean, you know, we've got reasons. Demonization means that the person you don't like, or the people you don't like, or the group you don't like, are the embodiment of evil. That's demonization. They are the devil. They're the devil. They're the devil in human clothing. That's demonization. So that's more than simply disliking somebody. Most people coming to America initially disliked the American Indians. They were in the way. and they had to be somehow removed, but they were never demonized. They were never portrayed as the embodiment of the devil. Now, if you are the devil, you have no right to exist. You may exist, but you have no right to exist. And if you are the devil, then the people who hate you have the right to eliminate you, because you are the force of evil. If you are the force of evil, you have no rights. You simply are there to destroy everybody else's rights, huh? So anti-Semitism is a modern movement, in a sense, which has roots in the past, but is very, very powerful. And it was imagined that the Holocaust, with all its horrors, and completed in 1945, would have shocked the world to such a degree that, in fact, it would disappear, vanish, go underground. I mean, nothing ever totally disappears, that it would be crushed. But recent events indicate that that is not the case. And in fact, anti-Semitism has taken a very novel turn, which could not have been predicted in 1945. And that is the discussion this morning. Now, any discussion of anti-Semitism has to start with the Jews. The Jews began as a nation somewhere around 3,000 years ago in a place called Judea, which today is called Israel. And in fact, the Jewish people was an independent nation for several hundred years, but then it suffered conquest. And after the conquest by all kinds of people, Assyrians, Chaldeans, Persians, Greeks, the Jews developed a form of government which oppressed people often form. Since they don't have any secular rulers, their rulers become the clergy. Both the Irish and the Poles developed that form of government. The Irish had their priests because the English took away their what? Their secular rulers, and in fact the Poles lost their secular rulers to the Russians, so also the clergy become, in a sense, the rulers. And in fact, government by the clergy has been the rule among the Jews for hundreds and hundreds of years. The first clergy were called the priests, and the second clergy that followed the priests were called the rabbis. Along the way, the Jews developed something called a dispersion. The Greek word for dispersion is diaspora. Many nations do. I mean, there are more Scots outside of Scotland than there are in Scotland. There are more Irish people outside of Ireland than there are in Ireland. So in time, living in a place that was not economically very reliable and which was subject to continuous conquest, the Jews emigrated. And they created a dispersion or diaspora which was larger than the population in the homeland. And finally, in the years 70 and in the years 135, the homeland was, for all practical purposes, destroyed by the Romans. And in fact, the Jews became a people of dispersion. That is, there was no homeland, there was just the diaspora. And during this whole period of time, of course, the rulers of the Jewish people were primarily the clergy. The priests had been replaced by the rabbis, but it was a people in which it almost became impossible to distinguish between nationality and religion. They just sort of what? They sort of went together. Now, along the way, the Jews became a provocative people, going all the way back to Greek and Roman times, even before Christianity. There were things about the Jews that aroused hostility among the people they lived. So the first was that the Jews denied the existence of all the gods of all the peoples they lived with, which means they couldn't have an interfaith banquet. No, you have to understand. Nice today is that everybody gets together and you get up and you say, well, this is what I believe, and then I say, well, thank you very much for sharing, and then somebody else gets up and thank you very much for sharing, and then we all eat chicken. You know the interfaith banquet, everybody's nice, because we live in a multicultural, nice society. So that statement was very provocative. The Jews said, your gods don't exist. Jupiter isn't real, Zeus isn't real, Juno isn't real, Aphrodite isn't real. I mean, it was provocative. And if some people got angry, it was what? No, it's understandable. It's a provocative statement. All right. The second reason was that the Jews had religious practices or cultural practices that made them exclusive. One of them was that they would only eat food that was especially prepared. We call it kosher food. Now, one of the ways in which you have what we call socializing is that somebody invites you over the house and what? You eat, I invite you over, you eat my food, and I go over your house and you eat my food. That's called socializing. I mean, how many places have I been traveling where somebody invites me in? I mean, you know, I have to drink camel's urine. I mean, the whole, I'm just trying to be nice. I'm just trying to, because you know, it's hospitality. You know, you don't say, no, I don't want it. So that was provocative. What it did was it prevented socialization, right? I mean, the failure to have what we call mutual eating prevents socialization, and Greek and Roman writers referred to this. Certainly one of the things about the Jews that was provocative, the way you showed your allegiance, the Pledge of Allegiance in the Roman Empire, was you went to a statue of the emperor who was a god and you put a little pinch of incense in front of it. Now, how do we feel about people who won't pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America? So there, I mean, that was what? I mean, that was overwhelmingly provocative. In addition, the Jews had become missionary in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. And they were beginning to recruit people from other places and other cultures, and in fact that was viewed as provocative. In the Greco-Roman world, the Jews engaged in a practice that was not provocative in Egypt or in the Semitic world, since everybody did it. It's called circumcision. From the Greco-Roman point of view, circumcision was viewed as a mutilation of the body, and therefore was regarded as something vile. And so that was a provocation. But certainly one of the major provocations, and it continues to be a provocation, the Jews started out as shepherds and farmers. But when the dispersion began, they followed their Phoenician cousins into something that we call trade and commerce. And they became overwhelmingly people of trade and commerce, and people of trade and commerce have always been provocative, because shepherds and farmers and people who work on the land say, who are these people? What do they do that's useful? I mean, they're distributors, they sell, they handle money. I mean, today in capitalist America, we totally understand it, because you can get a PhD and make what? A lot of money, and people, oh, that's wonderful. We applaud it. But for most of human history, people engaged in trade and commerce were viewed with great suspicion. All right, so they were, from the beginning, a provocative people, and what it triggered was hostility. The first anti-Jewish publication that we know of was published in Greek Alexandria. It was published by a man called Apion. We know about it because it's denounced in an historical work by a Jewish man called Josephus. And Apion now finds reasons for disliking and hating the Jews. He pokes fun at their culture, mocks their exclusiveness and separation and whatever. He's writing to a Greek audience. And in fact, there was a fairly high level of anti-Jewish feeling in the Greek world. And that precedes Christianity. And then in the 4th century AD, a religion which had its origins, ironically, in Judea, Christianity, now takes over the Roman Empire, the Greek and Roman world. And it has been competitive with the Jews, because the Jews have been pushing their religion, the Christians have been pushing their religion. In the contest, the Christians actually won. And having won, they had intrinsic to their message that there was one and only one legitimate path to divine favor. And that was the Christian path, and therefore it led to the suppression and repression of all other religions in the Roman Empire. One of the odd things that happened was all religions were repressed except one, and that was Judaism, which was allowed to remain, but only in what we call a humiliated form. The Jews were forbidden to recruit or to convert. The Jews were subject to economic restrictions. The Jews were subject to marriage restrictions. The Jews were subject to servant restrictions. I mean, the whole thing. We call that persecution. So now the Jews enter into a period of time where they're subject to persecution. In the 7th and 8th centuries, another religious movement arises which takes over most of what we call the Middle East. It's called Islam. And although I think the plight of the Jews under Islam was better than that under Christianity, the Muslims had the same message. We have what? One and only one true path. Muhammad himself was not overly friendly to the Jews. He had tried to convert them, and they had refused. And so even in the Quran, he speaks harshly about them. But there were many things about Jewish culture and Muslim culture that coincided. And for many centuries there were alliances between Muslims and Jews, but there were many centuries when there was active persecution. So now the Jews find themselves in an environment where they are not only disliked, they are also persecuted. Now, there was a cure during this period of time. The cure was very simple. The proclaimed hostility was to the religion, so that if Jews chose to become Christian or Muslim, they would then achieve all the rights of the people who were persecuting them, just convert. And in fact, many did. There were thousands of Jews over the centuries who chose to do that. But then in Europe, in Christian Europe, in the 12th and 13th centuries, things changed. The Jews who had come to Europe had come from Judea to Egypt, from Egypt to Greece, from Greece to Italy, and then in the 9th century they had crossed the Alps into northern Europe, into Germany, and into France and England. They were an essential part of the economy because indeed they were very important in the development of trade and commerce, and also they were the experts in something everybody denounces but wants. They were the experts in money. All right? So they were already, given popular prejudices, a controversial people. In the 11th and 12th centuries and 13th centuries, there began a war against the Muslim world that inflamed the Christian world. It's called the Crusades. And during the Crusades, the attitude to the Jews changed. At the beginning of the 13th century, in the year 1215, the Pope of the Western Church, Pope Innocent III, called what he designated as the Fourth Lateran Council. It was held in his palace in Rome, the Lateran Palace. And at that council, something happened that shifted anti-Judaism. It's the beginning of what we call the demonization of the Jew. At the Fourth Lateran Council, the Jews are not only described as infidels, or those who were responsible for the death of Christ. They are now referred to as demonic, as evil, as indeed the expression of the force of the devil. And in fact, it's in 1215 that for the first time laws are passed whereby Jews are to be designated by certain marks that they wear on their clothing, certain hats that they wear on their heads. And in fact, their trade and commercial practices are denounced. From that point on, there begins to evolve in Europe the beginnings of what we call anti-Semitism, which means that conversion alone will not solve the problem. And the great evidence for that is what happened in Christian Spain. In 1391, most of Christian Spain had succeeded in driving out the Muslims, except for a little place called Granada. And the two kingdoms of Castile and Aragon were triumphant. And it was in 1391 that a terrible massacre of Jews occurred. And in fact, thousands and thousands of them were forcibly converted to Catholicism. Now, over 2 or 3 generations, most of the Jews who had been converted and their children and grandchildren became faithful Catholics. In fact, many of them rose in the church to become priests and bishops. Many of them achieved office in the governments of Castile and Aragon. But then something happened. What happened, of course, was that a rumor started. The rumor was that, yes, they are Catholics, but you know they're still Jews. Now, that's not anti-Judaism, that's what? That's anti-Semitism. That's the beginning. The word wasn't used then, but it's not simply anti-Judaism, it's anti-Semitism, meaning conversion won't make any difference. Once Jewish, what? Always Jewish. And that led to the creation of an institution called the Spanish Inquisition, the purpose of which was to root out mainly all those Jews who presumably were Catholic but who really were Jewish, practiced their Judaism secretly, and in most cases they were perfectly innocent. They were brought to trial. One of the motivations was to confiscate their wealth. And so what emerged now in Spain and also in Portugal was a group of Jews who were testimony to the change. They're called Marranos. They were Catholic by religion, but they were regarded as Jewish by race. And therefore, they constituted a caste. Catholics of high family would not marry them. In fact, they married among each other and therefore what? Preserved their identity, even if they practiced the Catholic religion. And in fact, what happened in Spain is the beginning of what we call anti-Semitism. Now, all of this was aggravated by various things. The first was the emergence in the 16th century of the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther, like Muhammad, was initially friendly to the Jews. He thought that they would convert to the Protestant form of Christianity, if not to the Catholic. When they basically refused, he then turned on them, and in fact, he wrote a very vile denunciation of the Jews, which was not anti-Judaism, it was anti-Semitism. It was directed to their person and not to their faith. Most of the Jews had been driven by virtue of the persecution out of Western Europe into Eastern Europe, and they were concentrated in Eastern Europe, primarily in a large country called Poland, where they again became experts in trade and commerce, but their population was very, very dense. And in fact, their numbers invited hostility. In 1648, the economy of Poland collapsed because of an internal rebellion. And from that point on, the Poles went from prosperity to poverty. And with it followed the Jews. And of course, in trying to explain their poverty, there now arose what I call this new reason, which is not anti-Judaism, nothing to do with religion, it has to do with the person and the profession. The reason for all the poverty in Poland, the reason why it doesn't work economically, is because we have this parasitic population living among us called the Jews. Until 1800, almost 1800, the Jews in the Christian world were now enduring the beginnings of anti-Semitism, but then they experienced a relief. The relief came in the form of the same forces that created the American Revolution. In the 18th century, there emerged in Western Europe a movement that we call the Enlightenment. It was founded by people who were hostile to the power of the church, and they now presented an alternative way of doing things. Instead of faith, science. Instead of authoritarianism, personal freedom, and even democracy. And because the science provided the opportunities of power to the governments of Western Europe, the force of the Enlightenment grew, and it ultimately resulted in revolution. In 1789 began the French Revolution, and the French Revolution transformed the face of Europe. One of the first things the French revolutionaries did was to separate religion from government and to offer equality and freedom to all the people who would pledge their allegiance to the French state. And that included the Jews, and suddenly the Jews found themselves in an entirely new world. We call it the secular world. It's a world in which governments are not officially committed to any particular religion, and in which religion is a matter of personal choice. You can choose to be religious, you can choose what? Not to be religious, doesn't make any difference, as long as you pay your taxes. No. And out of it emerged a whole new educational system, which was open to anybody. Christians, Jews, if there were any Muslims around, we call it the secular educational system. So now not only were Jews emancipated, they were invited or allowed to enter into the educational institutions, and they moved in with great force. They saw education as a vehicle for, in a sense, rescuing themselves from persecution and from the humiliation which they had suffered. And in fact, through the 19th century, there now appeared the new Jewish profile. In addition to trade and commerce, there were now what? Physicians and lawyers and accountants and who knows what. But the profile still remained fairly urban. And then, well, came the crisis. And the crisis was a total surprise. The crisis that emerged really surprised the Jews. It surprised many of the people who were friends of the Jews. They didn't understand it. The crisis has its roots in the massive and overwhelming change that people were experiencing at this time. After all, the 19th century was the time of the Industrial Revolution, the age of science. When it began, the overwhelming majority of the people of Europe lived on farms in survival agriculture. And now came the trauma of urbanization, of thousands and millions of people all over Europe being forced to pick themselves up from their villages and to move to cities, sometimes small and in many cases big, and their whole life altered. It featured something that they weren't accustomed to called competition. Not only were they not guaranteed a job as they were in the village, they now had to compete for jobs. Sometimes they had them, sometimes they didn't have them. And instead of an environment, the village environment in which everybody cooperated, now they were in this harsh environment of competition. One of the challenges certainly was the family. In the urban environment, the family began to shrink in size. No longer did you have 3 or 4 generations living together. Now you had a mother and a father and the children, and the old support system that people had in the village was gone. And then people discovered they were in the culture of money. When you live in a village and you need something, and since you're related to everybody, you knock on the door and say, I need a cup of sugar. They'll give you a what? A cup of sugar. It even happens in neighborhoods now. No, sometimes. But when you live in anonymous urban environments, the way you trade, the way you get things is through money. Now they're emerged into this world of people, the culture of money. I need money. If I don't have money, I won't survive. If I do have money, I will survive. That wasn't true in the farm culture. And now money becomes increasingly important, and people don't understand it. They don't understand why it's worth a lot at one time, and then 3 years later, what? Their money is worthless and not worth anything. It's like our stocks. Okay. And people are, why? Why is this happening? It was a world of slums. They moved from the farms to the urban centers. Sometimes they're employed, sometimes they're not. These huge areas of urban slums now emerge all over Europe. And then the masses pick up a way of coping with all of this. It's a force that certainly was entertained by governments. It's called nationalism. I may not have any money, and I may not have a good job, and I may be down and out, but I am a German. And I'm what? Proud to be a German. I'm proud to be French. I'm proud to be English. And in fact, as the power of religion and the church declined, the power of nationalism only increased, which meant that now people made a very big and broad distinction between those people who belonged to their national group and those people who did not. Well, the trigger was that in 1873, 6 years before the word anti-Semitism was invented, in 1873, a major depression took place in Europe. It's worse than now, something like what happened in 1929. The banks failed. The banks collapsed. The world of money exploded. People who had money in the banks lost everything. There was nothing to guarantee their deposits. And now thousands and millions of people were asking, why? What is this terrible system that has put me in a situation like this? They were asking the question. Now, for many of the Jews in Western Europe, they had found the new economy okay, because for 1,800 years they had lived as a people of the middle class and commerce, and they sort of understood it. But more than that, their name was associated in the minds of many of these troubled people. Their name was associated with this world of trade and commerce and money, so that when people were asking why, and they wanted a simple answer, the answer that came up was the Jews. And in fact, there were political forces around that were willing to pick up on this answer, and that produced what I call first wave anti-Semitism. First wave anti-Semitism starts in 1873 and lasts until 1945. It's the same wave. In the 1870s and the 1880s and in the 1890s, there now appear in Western and Central Europe and even in Eastern Europe a new body of literature. We would call it anti-Semitic literature. Basically, this literature is written by people who are trying to explain why the Jews are evil, not just why they're another nationality or another religion you shouldn't like. Why they are evil, the embodiment of evil, because this whole economy, which is taking over the world, is controlled by the Jews, which had a certain ludicrous element to it. The overwhelming majority of the Jews of the world, 80% of the Jewish population of the world, lived in Poland and Russia, where they were dirt poor. But the name that always comes up is the name of one of the people who did develop investment banking originally. His name was Rothschild, and so that name always emerges, and so this is part of the literature. There are dozens of books. The most prominent ones were Edouard Roumont in France, who wrote La France Juive, Jewish France. There was Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who started out as an Englishman, related to Neville Chamberlain, by the way, that family, who moved to Germany and wrote at the beginning of the 20th century the foundations of the 19th century, in which he articulated this idea. And neither Chamberlain nor Drummond were interested in the religion. They're only interested in what they call the economic power. That's what they're interested in. They're interested in the economic power of the Jew. And in fact, this literature was to lead to dramatic consequences. The organization of political parties, which were, in terms of their major ideology, anti-Semitic. And a dramatic trial that galvanized the people of France, if not Europe, in the middle of the 1890s. The arrest of Captain Alfred Dreyfus, the accusation that he was an agent of the Germans, and in fact this whole panoply of accusations, if you will, were then drummed up, and France was now mobilized in a great anti-Jewish movement to punish Dreyfus and to punish the forces that were responsible for the disasters that France had endured, not only economic disasters, but also the military defeat that France had suffered under or against the Germans in 1871. So it just continued and continued and continued, and it was fed by other things. The First World War, in which millions of people died. And again, the same question arises. Why? And the answer that came up from these anti-Semitic forces was, well, the people who made money in this war were the people who manufactured the arms and munitions. Who were they? Well, they weren't the Jews, but what? That was the accusation, and that was believed by many, many people. In October or November of 1917, in Russia, the Tsarist government, having already been overthrown, the Kerensky government that followed, being very weak, was also overthrown, and the Bolsheviks came to power. Now, if you want to think of any force in the world that was hostile to the world of trade and commerce, it would be the Bolsheviks. So now let me tell you about the mentality of anti-Semitism. I used to be in classes, it never happened to me, but there were sometimes kids in the class, and the teacher in her mind thought this kid was responsible for everything evil in the class. Were you ever in a class like that? No matter what this kid did, do you understand? He could not win. So if an eraser was missing, it was what? His fault. if in the wastebasket was overturned, it was what? It was other kids. It was always him. So the same thing emerges now, which only complicates things. In fact, there emerges, before the First World War, a piece of anti-Semitic literature, which is regarded as the most powerful. It was published by Henry Ford in 1920 and 21 in the Dearborn Independent. It's called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It was commissioned by Russian intelligence to serve as a way of mobilizing the Russian people in the war against Japan. And in the Protocols, it says very clearly, the Jews are in charge of the world. They are an evil force. And what they do is they invent both capitalism and socialism. And then they set them fighting against each other. So now you have an explanation, right? The Jews have control of the capitalist world. The Jews control the communist world. They set the two worlds against each other. And in fact, all the people are pawns in their game. Well, that was to lead, of course, to the ultimate destruction. Now you have an ideology in force, and I want to say it was articulated. It's there in literature, in the minds of people. It can be convincing to people who aren't interested in religion at all. And in fact, most of the anti-Semitic leaders weren't interested in religion at all. And now, and there it is abroad. So all you need is another major trigger. And the major trigger, which is to lead to the Holocaust, the end of first wave anti-Semitism, happens on Wall Street in October of 1929. It's called the Depression. And now the Depression spreads all over the world. And now millions and millions and millions of people lose their jobs and lose their money and whatever. And now they ask the question, why? And there's an answer for those people who want a quick, easy answer. Certainly the answer was readily available even in North America. Henry Ford did many marvelous things to create and generate the auto industry. But one of the things he did do was to publish a newspaper which was one of the great anti-Semitic publications of all time, the Dearborn Independent. And in my childhood, there was a person on 12 Mile Road and Woodward. The building is still there, which was put up as a result of anti-Semitism, or partly as a result of anti-Semitism. It was Father Charles Coughlin, who would have liked to be the President of the United States. He couldn't because, like Jennifer Granholm, he was born in Canada. But I mean, his political ambitions were great, and all you had to do was tune in to the radio station, right, on Sunday, and there was the voice of Charles Coughlin. Those who didn't like him called him 12 Mile Charlie, but that didn't, that didn't ease the pain. I mean, there was the answer. It was an answer picked up in Europe. There was a movement that had started in Italy called fascism, which initially was not anti-Semitic. Mussolini was not anti-Semitic. But the fascism that emerged in Germany, which was built around the mobilization of disillusioned veterans of the First World War, that fascism did include anti-Semitism, articulated by the leader of this party called the Nazi Party, namely Adolf Hitler. And in fact, he used that ideology as a way of mobilizing the German people by saying, we have two enemies, both controlled by the Jews, and that's why the German people has no chance right now unless we understand who this enemy is and fight him. One enemy is communism, and the other enemy is the world controlled by the Jews, the world of Britain and the United States. It's the world of capitalism. And so out of it comes this propaganda which finds success because the Depression is there. And in fact, Hitler's power really comes after 1929, after 1930. By 1933, he's in charge of Germany, and the rest of the story is a story that is fairly familiar. Between 1933 and 1945, his assault on the Jews goes through various stages: boycott, confiscation, expulsion, and after 1939, when the Second World War began, extermination. So what were the consequences of the Holocaust? Right? Well, the first consequence of the Holocaust was that the Jewish people, the diaspora, which had been at 18 million, was now at 12 million. The part of the world which was most densely populated Jewishly is now a vacuum Jewishly. That is Central and Eastern Europe, like a big hole. And the main center of Jewish life that emerges after the Holocaust, it's interesting. The main center of Jewish life had been Europe. Ever since the 15th or 16th century, the overwhelming majority of the Jews of the world resided in Europe, and mainly in Eastern Europe. Now that's what? Like blown up. And now another place emerges as the center of the Jewish world. It's to enter into the story of Osama bin Laden. It's called the United States of America. One of the ways that Jews responded to the terrible anti-Semitism that emerged in Europe, which came as a surprise, especially to the Jews of Western Europe, was to flee. Most of those who fled from Eastern Europe. And they fled by the thousands and hundreds of thousands to the place which opened its doors to immigrants. And that was the United States of America. And there are many people in this room that are here by virtue of that emigration. And in fact, just before the Second World War, the U.S. Jewish population was somewhere between 5.5 to 6 million people, constituting, in terms of any given nation, the largest Jewish population in the world. All of that in response to the scourge of anti-Semitism. That's why they came. Now, so what the consequence is that the United States of America, which is a comparatively new country, right? Had you gone back 100 years, I mean, it had no place in Jewish history, right? Now becomes the major center of the Jewish people. One of the consequences of the Holocaust was another response to anti-Semitism. One of the responses to anti-Semitism, in particular in Eastern Europe at the end of the 19th century, had been, well, I wanted to be Polish, I wanted to be Russian, I wanted to be Romanian, but you won't let me be. So if you say I'm a separate nation, that I'm Jewish by nationality, then indeed I am. And so now I will try to go ahead and create a Jewish nation on its own territory, just as the Poles have their own, and the Romanians have their own, and the Russians have their own. And since you won't give us a piece of land in Europe, we'll go back to our ancient homeland in Palestine, and we will what? Create a new country, the land of the Jews. Oh, that's called Zionism. And in fact, thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of Jews joined the Zionist movement. Hundreds of them made their way to Palestine. The problem, of course, with Zionism was that going to America was more attractive than going to Palestine. But in 1924, the doors of the United States of America closed. And after 1924, increasing numbers of Jews, especially from Eastern Europe, chose to move to Palestine. So now, at the end of the Second World War, there were two emerging new centers. Do you understand? That really didn't exist before the Second World War. It's a totally traumatic and dramatic change. On the one side is the emergence of the Jewish community of the United States of America. On the other side is the emergence of the Palestinian yishuv, which is the Hebrew word for the settlement there. Well, it's a major and dramatic change. But you see, you can already see the beginning of the drama. The United States of America had already become, and was to remain for the rest of the 20th century, the leading military and economic power in the world. So, if you wanted to ask the question, who controls the economy of the world, you could easily say, the United States of America. And if the largest Jewish community lives in the United States of America, you can just move over just a little bit, and then you can say, if you're an anti-Semite, the largest Jewish community in the world lives in America. America is the most powerful nation in the world, controlling the economies of the world. Ergo, therefore, the Jews control America. Oh. And American policy is what? The policy of the Jews. And that already, I mean, it was there. I mean, Hitler used it. And that accusation was to remain. But I do want to say that one of the consequences of the Holocaust was the enormous shame and guilt felt by the world. I mean, that this thing had happened and nothing was done. Two things, therefore, resulted. One, uttering anti-Semitic propaganda in public became a no-no. Do you understand? No-no. I mean, even if you were an arch anti-Semite, you couldn't get up at any public meeting anymore and do what Father Coughlin had done. You couldn't go. No, 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 no. Politically, we use that phrase now, politically incorrect. It might be uttered privately, but it could not be uttered publicly. It was one of the consequences. And the second consequence was the emergence of the State of Israel. Because you see, and this is so interesting, just at the moment when the Holocaust finishes, another provocation arises. That is, one of the ways to deal with the refugees of the Holocaust was to provide them refuge in the State of Israel. But the State of Israel was now to inflame a world that had not been historically anti-Semitic. And that was the Arab and Muslim world. Right, so just at the moment that the Holocaust was finished, one of the solutions, that is, one of the ways to respond to the Holocaust, was to end up being overwhelmingly provocative. And in fact, in 1948 and 1949, the only people who dared publicly to utter anti-Jewish propaganda now appeared in the Arab. Do you understand? Now appeared in the Arab. It's so ironic. And now you're beginning to see something that is the story, the shift. In Europe, or most of Europe, it's banned publicly. You can't ban it, what, private? How can you ban something privately, right? You can't ban it privately, but you can ban it publicly. And in fact, in places like West Germany, you could be arrested and fined and put in jail for publicly uttering anti-Semitic propaganda. No. But just as all of this is happening in Europe in response to the Holocaust, this new provocation is emerging. Now, one of the interesting things that happened right after the Holocaust, which is fascinating, there was a part of the Jewish world that for a while was cut off from the Jewish world. The Bolshevik Revolution created the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union cut off its people from what? The rest of the world. And there were over 3 million Jews. That's 1/4 of the Jewish population of the world remaining in the Soviet Union that had survived the Holocaust. Now, one of the most intriguing things that happened. Now, in the Soviet Union, the public utterance of anti-Semitism was forbidden because communism theoretically was what? Opposed to, well, no, religion is opposed to anti-Semitism. It says, in fact, anti-Semitism is the creation of capitalist people who wish to divert the masses from their problem, and there it is. So you couldn't utter anti-Semitic propaganda publicly in the Soviet Union. Privately, oh yeah, but not publicly. But only a few years after the Second World War, Stalin turned against the Jews. I mean, it's only 3 years after the Holocaust. There are 3 million Jews in the Soviet Union. I mean, Stalin had come to power with anti-Semitism, not public anti-Semitism, but what I call private anti-Semitism. His great enemy was a Jewish leader in the Bolshevik Revolution. His name was Leon Trotsky. And he had to defeat Trotsky, and he used anti-Semitic propaganda to defeat Trotsky. And having come to power, the people he brought to serve him on the whole had edges of what we call anti-Semitism. Following the Second World War, Stalin did develop a slight case of paranoia. But again, it was more than that. Anti-Semitism was useful to him. And in fact, he became deeply suspicious of the Jews because the Jews had connections and loyalties to people outside the Soviet Union. And in 1948, there began the persecution, a persecution which was to last until Stalin himself died in 1953. In 1952, he devised a plan. This is only 7 years after the Holocaust. He devised a plan where all the Jews of the Soviet Union would be deported to eastern Siberia. And in fact, that was started, the deportation was started by what's called the doctor's plot, in which many prominent Jewish doctors were arrested and accused of poisoning Stalin and public officials. And had Stalin not died, it's quite possible that this project would have been carried through 8 years after the end of the Holocaust. So what we're dealing with is, although Hitler was defeated, anti-Semitism as an ideology, do you understand, stands on its own. It remains useful. And why does it remain useful? It remains useful because it explains to people why things don't work. And in the Soviet Union, I have to tell you, lots of things didn't, do you understand? Didn't work. I mean, they had just suffered the devastation of the Second World War. And in fact, hundreds and thousands of Soviet citizens